After the War of 1971, which literally redrew the map of South Asia, India and Pakistan found themselves at a crossroads. And for the next 20 years, well, they were locked in this incredibly frustrating dance, a cycle of what looked like amazing progress, only to be followed by these sudden, sharp reversals. So, let's get into this tumultuous story of two nations trying and often failing to get out from under the shadow of conflict. I mean, that was the fundamental question, right? The 1971 war wasn't just another battle. It led to the birth of an entirely new nation, Bangladesh, from what used to be East Pakistan. The wounds were incredibly deep, the mistrust was absolute, and you had over 90,000 Pakistani soldiers and civilians sitting as prisoners of war in India. So where do you even start to pick up the pieces? Okay, so the very first task was just this massive humanitarian and logistical nightmare. Before anyone could even think about political progress, they had to deal with the human cost of the war. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who were displaced or imprisoned. And just look at the sheer scale of this operation. With the UN supervising, this enormous three-way repatriation got underway. You had about 122,000 Bengalis who were stuck in Pakistan sent to Bangladesh. At the same time, over 119,000 non-Bengalis, or Biharis, were airlifted from Bangladesh to Pakistan. And of course, there were all those Pakistani prisoners of war in India. It was a monumental effort just to get people back home. But, even this humanitarian effort got all tangled up in politics. Pakistan, at first, just flat out refused to recognize Bangladesh as its own country. Their argument was, hey, Indian troops are still on your soil, and you haven't returned our prisoners of war. But for Bangladesh, the position was simple, non-negotiable. No recognition, no talking. This diplomatic standoff pretty much became the first huge hurdle to getting back to normal. So despite all that deep-seated hostility, the mid-1970s saw this surprising thaw. Slowly but surely, diplomacy started to chip away at that wall of silence. Let's take a look at how this fragile progress actually started to happen. And this period of progress was really something. In February 1974, after the Organization of Islamic Conference helped mediate, Pakistan finally recognized Bangladesh. And that unlocked everything. Suddenly, there were agreements to resume mail and phone calls, the trade embargo that had been in place since the 1965 war was lifted. By 1976, you had trains and planes crossing the border again, and full diplomatic relations were back. It really genuinely felt like a new chapter was starting. And then, just as all this positive momentum was building, an event sent shockwaves across the subcontinent that shattered all that fragile goodwill almost overnight. On May 18, 1974, India carried out its first nuclear test. They called it a peaceful nuclear explosion. Well, for Pakistan, there was absolutely nothing peaceful about it. They saw it as a direct threat. Their leader, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, called it a grand design to intimidate them. The fallout was immediate. Upcoming talks were canceled, tensions flared right back up, and the whole atmosphere for dialogue became, as our source material says, unfavorable. This was the first major step back. So just as the two countries were cautiously starting to talk again in the late 70s, a new geopolitical earthquake hit the region, one that would pull them onto opposite sides of a global power struggle. It's a fair question, right? I mean, after the nuclear shock, things did eventually calm down a bit. But the next crisis wasn't going to come from inside the relationship. No, it was going to come from their neighbor to the north. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and India and Pakistan found themselves on completely different teams. Pakistan, now a frontline state against the Soviets, was dead set against the intervention and became a key partner for the United States, taking in tons of security aid. India, on the other hand, was much more sympathetic to the Soviets, kind of seeing their move as a response to the US and Pakistan backing anti-government groups in Kabul. So here's the crucial part. For India, the American decision to arm Pakistan with advanced weapons like F-16 fighter jets was seen as a way bigger threat than the Soviet army in Afghanistan. This brought back the old US-Pakistan security alliance from the Cold War, kicked off a new arms race, and created this fundamental disagreement on what each country could call legitimate for its own defense. The 1980s then turned into this decade of, you could call it hot and cold diplomacy. You had constant talks, constant proposals, but they were all happening with this backdrop of rising tensions, proxy fights, and just this deep, deep mistrust. This slide just perfectly captures the diplomatic mess of that time. To try and calm India's fears about all the new American weapons, Pakistan offered a no-war pact. India came back with a counteroffer, a treaty of friendship. But
The devil was in the details. India's proposal said Pakistan couldn't have foreign military bases on its soil and couldn't bring up their disputes at international forums. Pakistan just wasn't willing to sign away what it saw as its basic rights. They couldn't even agree on the ground rules for peace.
And while the diplomats were busy talking, the situation on the ground was just getting worse. A brand new conflict exploded on the Siachen Glacier. India was constantly accusing Pakistan of arming and training Sikh militants in Punjab. And then in 1986, India launched Operation Brass Tacks, this gigantic military exercise that Pakistan was sure was a setup for an invasion. Both armies went on full alert, and they came dangerously close to another full-blown war. Just to give you a sense of how totally extreme things had gotten, look at that number. 21,000 feet. That's the altitude of the Siachen Glacier. Soldiers were fighting in a place so inhospitable that neither country had ever even bothered to put troops there before 1984. It was a brutal, costly, and strategically questionable new front in a relationship that was already stretched to its limit. So after coming right to the brink of war, the late 1980s brought another surprise twist. The rise of new democratically elected leaders in both countries created this brief but very real window of opportunity for peace. This quote just perfectly captures that sudden burst of optimism. When Benazir Bhutto became Prime Minister of Pakistan, her Indian counterpart Rajiv Gandhi sent her this message. They were both young, modern leaders, and it seemed like they weren't carrying all the bitter historical baggage of the leaders before them. There was some genuine hope for a real breakthrough. And this hope actually turned into real action. Rajiv Gandhi visited Islamabad, which was a hugely symbolic trip. They signed 3 agreements on things like cultural cooperation and avoiding double taxation. But the most important one, the key pact, was an agreement not to attack each other's nuclear sites. In a region totally haunted by the bomb, this was a massive step forward, a real sign that trust was being built at the very top. And that's always the question that hangs over this relationship, isn't it? A handshake and a few pieces of paper are one thing, but the core issues, the ones that had been festering for decades, they hadn't just disappeared. And sure enough, the hard realities came crashing back in. By 1989, a massive insurgency blew up in Indian-administered Kashmir, and relations soured instantly as all the old accusations came flying back. The agreement to pull troops back from Siachen? It stalled as soon as it got to the military leadership on both sides, a classic case of how the system can just override political will. And even with the non-attack pact, the 2 prime ministers were still disagreeing in public about the nuclear issue. The goodwill of 1988 was totally swallowed up by the conflicts of 1989 and 1990. The cycle had just repeated itself again. And that really is the heart of it all. This 20-year period shows us this repeating pattern of progress and retreat, of hope and then despair. It proves that while leaders can have breakthroughs, the structural problems and the deep-seated mistrust in the India-Pakistan relationship have, time and time again, pulled them back from the brink of peace. It leaves us all wondering about the fundamental nature of this rivalry.